Right off the bat, we have the several pairs of wings, the eyes, the multitude of eyes. And so I'm like, whoa, that is a depiction of a seraphim. Is this an angelic being from God, or is it an enemy?
This adaptation by Del Toro, I think, is kind of a synthesis between the book, having now read it, and the Disney movie, and just the Pinocchio story in general. Supposedly being alive does not count as being a real boy.
Say, like, the spiritual side of stop motion animation is that you are playing creator, but there is no room for free will. Like, they're very in control of what's happening in the film, and there isn't really room for error because you're creating all the errors.
Welcome to the Catholic Film Club, where we talk craft and conscience at the movies. I'm Michael Coy, and I'm joined by John and Jessica Beyer of Oasis Studio 7. John and Jessica, thanks for joining me in our studio at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas.
Thank you so much for having us. We're very flattered that you invited us on the show.
Well, it was great to meet you guys because you guys are new to Atchison. Me and my wife my family's fairly new to Atchison, so it was just cool to find other creatives. I don't know if I like that word so much, but other people in the industry who are in this small but growing town.
Yeah, that's why we ended up reaching out to you, is because we were interested to finding, are there other video editors and people that produce a film in the town. And so we're really happy to meet someone like you.
And what do you guys do at Oasis Studio 7?
Yeah, so Oasis Studio 7, we started it in 2021. We started working with Jimmy Akin on his weekly podcast, Mysterious Worlds, and he's still one of our main clients and ongoing. Since then, we've worked with other clients as well, like Catholic Answers and Source and Summit, which does liturgy books. So we do a mix of computer animation and podcast editing, video editing.
She went to school for animation, and so she's the animator. I pretty much only do video editing and motion graphics. But I also am a fan of movies and music, so.
Yeah. Well, I kind of wanted other people who work in creative fields to come on, because the movie that we're talking about, which is Guillermo Del Toro's adaptation of Pinocchio, I think the filmmaking aspect is not just the most visually appealing part of the movie, but I think it has a lot to do with the substance of the movie itself. But before I get to that, we're also we're all parents of fairly young kids, around the same age, and this is in theory a kids movie. And we've also been reading the book Pinocchio, because the well-read mom. Can you describe the well-read mom and what we're?
Well, I'm fairly new to it, but it's been wonderful for getting back into reading with kids, because it's something I enjoyed before kids, and I find myself only reading children's books. So this well-read moms group is a great prompting to sit down and spend time reading more mature books, and then getting together every month with other moms primarily and wives, and talking about deeper themes and subjects in these books.
Yeah, it's a nationwide book club that was started by Marcy Stockman, and I just find that when my wife Ella's reading a book, I will often just start picking it up too, just to be part of the Atchison conversation for one thing. But these are both things that are meant for children, and
Well, you would think it was meant for children, because the Italian classic Pinocchio was definitely geared towards children, especially perhaps ornery boys, because the book is just filled with one lesson after the other. Why you don't talk to strangers, why you should go to school, why you shouldn't lie, why you shouldn't gamble. All these lessons, one after the other. Pinocchio does them all, and he gets a hefty price for everything he does. And so you would think that this movie, and this movie is also animated. And so although I think the major audience that watches the movie will be children, Guillermo Del Toro himself said that this wasn't made for children in one of his interviews that we watched. And so And when you watch it, you realize that it is full of adult themes and adult questions. And so, yeah.
Even more than the Disney movie, which this adaptation by Del Toro, I think is kind of a synthesis between the book, having now read it, and the Disney movie. There's a lot of things that are in this adaptation, like the Blue Fairy, quote unquote, the Blue Fairy bringing Pinocchio to life. That's just not in the book, surprisingly. In the book, Pinocchio is alive from the start.
Yes, right. Exactly. Before he was even carved into a puppet in the book, the wood was already alive. And so we don't have that same symbolism there of who is the life-giving source.
Yeah.
Who breathes life into the puppet.
These are the big questions that are brought up just from this story, and I think it's interesting to see a modern filmmaker like Del Toro wrestling with them. But I did want to ask, because you're talking about things that are for kids or not for kids, what's your approach to kids entertainment these days? Like, I know that at our house, we often go back to what we watched when we were kids. Like, we're often like showing our daughter Little Bear because that was something wholesome that we grew up with, that we kind of know didn't mess us up as far as we know.
And you've kind of screened them in a way, right? You've already screened them through childhood, and so you know what you're exposing your child to. So that is helpful. We do the same thing in our house. If you're familiar with Montessori's program, Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, that's something that I look back on a lot for understanding where my girls are between the 3 to 6 year old range, where they're really attracted to joy and light. And so even watching this movie and reading this book, I found myself leaning back on those theories of what is this younger child drawn to. And so that gives light to the question of, is this for children, and what age of children would it be appropriate for? So that's one thing I look for in what movies we're watching with our kids too, is what is showing light and beauty and goodness, and that's going to lend to their joy and their understanding of the world in an appropriate way, where it's clear distinctions of what is good and what is evil, right? Because there can be a blurry line.
Yeah, and as Catholic parents, our number one goal is always, what is everything we can do to get our children to heaven? And so when it comes to what movies do we let them watch, because that involves a little bit of sheltering. And I would argue that every parent will shelter at some degree. It's just, where's that degree at? Like, you're not going to let your 4-year-old just watch straight rated R movies all the time. That's going to traumatize them probably. And so you just have to figure out, where's that line. And so we try to figure out, okay, is this going to hinder their growth? Is this going to hinder them from finding God and their relationship with Jesus? Or is it going to be affected at all? Like, mostly we watch movies for entertainment reasons. But sometimes they can have good lessons and sometimes they can have bad lessons. And this particular movie, I would argue, has some adult themes in it that would not be good for young children, at least. Perhaps teenagers can wrestle with the questions that they pose.
Because Pinocchio, like, let's say I would show and have been showing my daughter. So I've shown my daughter a bit of the Disney Pinocchio, and that is for children. Like, that is something with very clear lines.
Yeah, we do watch Disney movies in our house. Not all of them.
No, but, not us either.
It's harder to pick these days, but we do let them watch most of them for sure.
Did you take your kids to the Minecraft movie?
No.
I've never taken my kid to any movies yet. So we have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old and one that will be born in July. God willing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we haven't yet brought them to the movies, but that's going to be a fun experience when we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't wait. I wish my daughter was old enough to go to King of Kings, which is coming out soon. That looks like a nice.
Did you
film.
watch the Minecraft?
No, I didn't.
I saw trailers. So I actually thought the trailers...
I'm the only one in America.
I thought the trailers looked really interesting, but then when I saw the internet say how bad it was, I was kind of surprised. But
I think back though on the stupid movies I made my parents go to, like Pokemon the movie.
Oh my
Just like
gosh.
my poor dad.
It's funny, on my birthday we went to the Pokemon movie, and I think my dad was asleep. For sure.
I think my dad was just looking over at me, just like crying when Pikachu, spoiler, dies, and then spoiler comes back to life because of the tears of all the Pokemon. It was just like,
goodness.
What am I doing here? I can't imagine like
The sacrifices of our parents.
I know.
Yeah.
Will I make those sacrifices someday? I wonder. But yeah, so like right now it's important though, like we're thinking a lot about curating movies. I don't know if at what age I would let my kids watch this movie. In some ways it's almost too subversive, I think, to show to a kid. Like the themes that it's tackling, I think, are ultimately truthful, but they are a little too complex, because Pinocchio has generally been about be obedient. You must be obedient, for instance, to your father, and disobedience will lead you astray. And this movie introduces the theme of disobedience as a virtue.
Yes.
Which it can be.
Yes,
Which it can be. And like, I think like a Catholic in a secular world can understand that disobedience has a virtue, has a place. I think, but where that line is maybe a bit too complex for a kid, or are we underestimating them? It's hard.
Well, I think for a kid watching, they're going to get this clear lesson that sometimes it's okay to lie, because one of the lessons in the movie is, in order to save everybody, Pinocchio needs to lie so that his nose will grow and create a bridge. And so he lies and lies and lies and lies. And so that's giving this message of, okay, sometimes it's okay to lie. But for a young child, I don't think they need to be thinking about that nuance. And as a Catholic, it's definitely debatable. I mean, Jimmy Akin has a debate on whether lies are ever acceptable. And I would highly encourage you to check that out on YouTube. But so yeah, that is a very deep subject right there. And I don't think I would want my kid to ever think that it's okay to lie, for the most part. But yeah, let's go ahead and let's talk about what these adult themes are when I watched.
Yeah. Here, let me for someone just entering the story set up what the story is, because we know the classic Pinocchio, which is, I'll start with the Disney movie because that's what everybody knows, which is not necessarily the book or this movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Disney movie, of course, is you've got this lonely clockmaker Geppetto, also a carpenter, and all he wants is a son, and he carves a wooden boy out of this desire, and then a blue fairy magically shows up, gives him the gift of life for the happiness of Geppetto. Jiminy Cricket, a talking cricket, happens to walk by, and the blue fairy says, well, you have to be this boy's conscience. And throughout the story, Pinocchio is given the chance to be a good, obedient boy, but he keeps taking the other road, and until at the end he has to basically sacrifice himself to save his father from Monstro the whale. And the book has similar aspects to that. The book, he's a bit more of a, how would you describe
and the book
difference?
comes first, right?
Well, the book is first, yeah.
But when I read the book, I was familiar with the Disney Pinocchio. And so I was reading the book kind of with the familiar story of the 1940s Disney Pinocchio in mind. Mm-hmm. And I was very surprised of just how many things happened to Pinocchio that's not at all covered in the movie at all.
Yeah. So for instance, Pinocchio, as you've said before, is just a living piece of wood, and there's never an explanation of why. Mm-hmm. He's given form by Geppetto. He's carved into a boy by Geppetto. He's given a form, but he's not.
But he was already alive as a piece of wood. Yeah. And when he cried out, "Don't burn me!" You know?
It's so charming.
It's very interesting.
What surprised you about the book? I know we want to talk about the movie,
let's go ahead.
but what did surprise you about the book?
Sure. Well, one thing with the book is how unlikable Pinocchio was, at least to me. And we've talked before about if we're watching a movie and at the end we're feeling like this was not fulfilling, edifying at all. It's because none of the characters were likable. And I felt like that reading this book. What really held my attention, because he himself was very disobedient and he kept saying, I'll resolve to do better. And then he would go in the opposite direction. What was intriguing was the unique situation of having this piece of wood. And so it was the very singular nature of him, and you're intrigued by what gave him life and what will he do, especially given what I know from the Disney version. How will this differ? And so that was surprising, and that led to more surprise when he is watching the puppetry show and you realize, oh, there are all these other living puppets. So that was a surprise to me as well.
Well, the interesting thing about all of these is that, and just the Pinocchio story in general, is that somehow thinking and living and like supposedly being alive does not count as being a real boy. Like, you're alive.
Oh yeah.
He's conscious. He's thinking. He's making decisions, but he's not real.
He's not a human boy.
Real in this case, I think across the board, well, at least in the Disney movie, means being good. Like, that seems to be what a real boy means to these authors.
Interesting.
And the nature of Pinocchio is so interesting across these ones. Now, the difference, since we're starting at the origin, I think the origin's important to start with of Pinocchio. You got the Disney one, you've got the book. Now, the origin of Pinocchio in this movie, the Del Toro one, is that Geppetto actually had a real son before named Carlo, in this case, hearkening back to the author Carlo Collodi.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good connection.
And Carlo dies, and then Geppetto in the movie, and Geppetto mourns over his grave. Over the grave, a tree grows, and he chops down that tree in despair, constructs the wooden boy out of a feeble attempt to resurrect his son. A wood sprite comes along, gives him life for the purpose of making Geppetto happy. But what is Pinocchio in this case is very different. He comes from a tree. Jiminy Cricket in this case lived in the knot hole in the tree, and he identifies Pinocchio as a house. And he says, leave that puppet alone. He's like, I'm a homeowner. I don't know. It's just all these things.
I think the cricket is supposed to also be his conscience.
Yeah,
in a way, he lives in his heart, you know. So
right, in a way, he's the conscience in the original story, but he's not so close there, and actually is destroyed right off upon meeting Pinocchio, and then he comes back.
Well, it's funny when Pinocchio leaves his father, he puts the cricket in a jar, and then he leaves. You know, he leaves his conscience behind so that he can go and do this other thing. It's interesting. I don't know if that was Del Toro's idea, but that's kind of what I thought.
Yeah. But that's the setup, and it also takes place in fascist Italy, which is an update on Del Toro's part, and I think that's in a way to set up that disobedience can sometimes be a virtue, because disobedience in that culture would have been a virtue at great risk, personal risk. But to return to just like our thoughts on the movie and like how each one surprised us, Pinocchio the book, if we're like going back to like, for some reason, the Disney movie is just what everyone thinks about. When I read it, I felt it almost like reconstructed my view, and this movie deconstructs what Pinocchio has been about in people's minds. Rick, he kind of like keeps reversing themes. Like, I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I think that this movie was almost an entirely different story, especially bringing in World War II in Italy, and also bringing in the death of Carlo, because you have a completely different dynamic in this movie. And also, the only things that are similar between the book and the movie that happens to Pinocchio is that he meets a puppeteer and that he gets swallowed by the dogfish. And I would say that everything else that happens isn't really in the book. And so I think it's like, it's the same characters, but it's really a different story, a very different story.
Yeah, because you're putting even if things are the same,
which is interesting.
Yeah, even if things are the same, like the Island of Lost Boys becomes, Pleasure Island. That's what it is. Pleasure Island becomes a kind of a fascist youth training camp. Like that's what that segment of this story takes. But yeah, even so, Pinocchio is so different. The journey becomes different. The lessons become different. Jessica, what kind of took you by surprise in this movie, or what were your initial thoughts of it?
Right. Well, yeah. So one thing that was definitely a surprise was just how very little it had in common with the original story. But really, what captivated me was, from the very beginning, the use of camera movement for the stop motion. So stop motion itself is very time intense, and you need a lot of attention to detail. But to add into that, as they're doing this pan around Geppetto and Pinocchio and changing the scene as they're panning around, or you have the rack focus and the zoom changes, I just thought that was really beautiful, of thinking of how technical and very detailed they needed to be to not only manipulate the characters, but also manipulate the camera, which I know Del Toro was really excited for. Was he was saying, I want to be able to use the camera like I do in live action. And that's why I want the stop motion space. I don't want it digital. I want it to be physical space that I can move my camera around. So that was really interesting to see.
Yeah, and a huge shout out to the co-director, Mark Gustafson, Mark Gustafson is the one who handled all the animation. And he actually worked on another movie called Fantastic Mr. Fox by Wes Anderson, which is another movie that's like for kids, quote unquote, but is it? He worked on the California Raisins way back in the day, and he passed away really young, like at 64, which is very sad. But because I think he was, at that especially, like a genius. But the interesting thing about it is that Pinocchio is a real boy, and he wants, or is a puppet. He wants to be a real boy, and yet all the people around him are technically puppets. They're these stop motion, 3-dimensional characters. And I was like, okay, that has to be intentional. And then I'm watching it and I hear lines like Pinocchio shouting at the town mayor, "Who controls you?" When he's asked, like, "Where's your strings? Who controls you?" He says, "Who controls you?" Suddenly what I'm seeing is an existential question about free will. And, so I think that's just like a really brilliant element. Like, it doesn't, like, it's beautiful, but it's almost like there's that other layer other than just the aesthetic beauty that it adds. What was your view on the stop motion, Jessica? I
thought it was beautiful. And to be honest, when we watched it several times, but the first time, for a little bit, I was just in awe. And then John made a comment about, this looks like this is greatly animated. And I said, it's stop motion. And he said, wait, all of it stop motion?
Yeah, actually, I've never seen a stop motion that had that much beauty and detail put into the characters. I was very impressed. And that was the first thing that shocked me, was how beautiful it was made.
Right. And although I think you did something keyed you in with, at times you could see the missed frames, because stop motion is traditionally done about 24 frames per second, and we filmed 60 frames per second. So you could see that lag. There was a little bit of jolt in movement. And
you found out how long some of these scenes took.
Right.
How long?
Yeah. So with the studio they worked with, it would take an animator maybe 2 weeks to do 3 seconds of animation. And then for those scenes that we saw with Pinocchio and Death, when they were having those conversations, that took an animator 2 years in a dark room to create those scenes. And that's just incredible.
It's an incredible amount of time.
Right. That's a lot of devotion and a lot of attention to that particular
See,
moment.
I don't know. I made with my Lego figures and Bionicles like an action scene where they like sword fought, and I did that in like 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how impressive that is, but anyway.
Well, actually, as an animator, that's something that people always come to us with work, and they are surprised at how long it does take to animate something.
I just want to note that this movie was very much this passion project for Del Toro.
Oh my
and
gosh,
that was
it took so
really
long.
interesting to dive into. Probably over a decade, yes. I think it was supposed to release in the early 2000s. And for whatever reason, things fell through. And then it was supposed to be released in the 2010s. And he had a lack of funding. And finally, Netflix said, well, we'll provide what you need in the budget. And that's why the show ultimately went to Netflix. But it began all the way back with his mother taking him to the movies. Just like we're talking about our parents taking us to the movies as kids. I think she was doing more of the films that she wanted to see. And so as a concession, the second or third, they saw Pinocchio in theaters. And there's something that resonated with Del Toro in the story of Pinocchio. And it's something that bonded he and his mother throughout his life, because every few years at Christmas, she would give him some puppet representation of Pinocchio. And so it was something that was very important to the relationship, and she wanted to like encourage him to one day make a film about this story. And sadly, she died the day before it was released at the London Film Festival. So this is very much in memory of Del Toro's mother. And so it's really interesting then how long it took to produce. And then you ask, well, okay, why was it stop motion? Because a lot of people told him, we could easily do it within your budget if we just send it to the studio for computer animation. He said, no. One, like we talked about, I want to move the camera around like I do in live action. Two, this wasn't his first stop motion. He had tried to produce a stop motion in South America. And there was a fire at one point in the warehouse which burned the hundreds of puppets they had and props. Yes. So he took that tragedy as a sign that he was only supposed to work in live action. But I think in his heart, he still really wanted to produce this stop motion film
And
with the
probably
story
for
he
the
loved.
reasons that you mentioned, that he wanted to show that everybody was puppets, right?
Right.
Like everybody is being controlled.
Or are they? I mean, I think the beautiful thing about animation is that, yes, we give an illusion of life, but we wouldn't be able to do that unless we were alive, unless we had that view. But it is to bring up questions of free will and obedience, and what are we obedient to? In some ways, I feel like at the end he's saying we're obedient ultimately to the laws of nature. We can't help but be obedient to the laws of nature. That's a certainty. But within that mystery of when we begin and when we end on this earth, I think to him it's still a mystery, which is why it's so fascinating that he was so driven to complete it.
Yeah, you bring up free will though, and that's what's interesting to me about choosing stop motion, because every aspect is in your control, and there really isn't the free will for, say, the laws of nature, because you're needing to recreate those at every moment. How is this moving? And even like when you look at the design of the puppets themselves, Del Toro was very much in control, and it could take a year to design and fabricate one of these puppets. And they would send images or the physical object to Del Toro, and he would say, no, especially because they look too perfect. And he's very attentive to what is grounded in reality. So he'd say, it's got to be dirtied up, or add a rip in the monkey's pants, make it look worn and weathered. This can't be fresh out of the shop. And so he was very much, and of course, Gustafsson and the others, Shadow Machine, like they're very in control of what's happening in the film. And there isn't really room for error, because you're creating all the errors. You're in control of, if, say, they were attentive to making mistakes. So the puppet's like reaching down to pick something up and they missed it and they've got to reach again and pick it up correctly. But all of that needed to be fabricated. They had to plan all of that ahead of time. And so it's interesting to me, say like the spiritual side of stop motion animation is that you are playing creator, but there is no room for free will.
Oh yeah, in the world that you're creating.
Right.
In live action film, there's this phrase happy accidents, which is where a butterfly lands on your shoulder and you didn't think about, like, there's no way you could have planned for that. That's never going to happen in stop motion.
Right. You control the lighting, you built up the world exactly how you imagine it. You move the camera exactly where it needs to be, because otherwise you don't complete the shot or you don't have that smooth pan that they were accomplishing in this film. So yes, there are no happy accidents unless it was they gave the animator some freedom, which is possible, but then it was the animator's choice, right? So like you could have 40 animators working on 60 different sets at the same time with this film, and surely it could be that some of them made decisions and creatively Del Toro checked it and okay, we can do this. But I think mostly it was fermenting. The story has been in his mind since childhood. And then for about 20 years, he's been working on the film itself, right? With sketches and creating the story for the film. And so he was very particular about how it would be executed and realized.
Yeah. I don't know how you can animate something like this at this level of detail where someone could watch it and be surprised that it's all animated, like handcrafted, and not have like appreciation for like the world around you and just like everything that goes into this faux wood table and just like the movement of the
How
human
they did
hands.
the water. And the fire.
Even the fire is handcrafted in this movie to a large extent. But yeah, just like the movements of a face like take weeks to pull off, and I don't know. That's what I think about with stop motion. Did you guys ever do like a Lego stop motion or something, or like claymations when you were a kid?
I didn't, but
Right. I've done several in my youth. With stop motion paper, with physical objects, right? So yes, like to your point, there's a lot of studying the world and really slowing down and being attentive to everything around you. And it's not just the physicality of something, but you're also trying to replicate in stop motion and in computer animation the laws of, say, gravity and the wind. And so I know one thing animators pointed out was Volte in the movie when he's jumping with a cape and the way that they needed to reinvent how his cape was flowing in a wind that didn't exist, because his cape isn't a live action moving in the wind, but it's part of the puppetry. So that is like a very unique aspect of stop motion and animation, is how much you have to reinvent the whole world and all the laws of the world.
Yeah. I for like, another era when I was in college, I did a paper about the Disney animators, and they wrote this book called The Illusion of Life. And what they said was that what they found was that if they just filmed someone in live action and painted over every frame, for somehow what looked lifelike looked dead and almost like they were being, it just didn't have any life or character to it, even though it was the exact same motions that they were just literally tracing. That was called I forget what the term is, but so what they found is that to give things character, they had to exaggerate and they had to like really put their personality into animation, and that was what gave the illusion of life. And that's another way for me where like just the art of animation itself, it's like, oh, you wouldn't be able to do this unless you had like I wouldn't be able to give such life to this little puppet right here on my microphone if I didn't have the gift of life. Sorry.
Yeah. I see what you mean.
That's not to like overwhelm you with beauty right there, but anyway, that's just what I like to wax poetic on.
So when you're first learning the rules and the techniques of animation, so I started with hand drawn, and I actually first studied at Truman State University, when I was in 8th grade. I took a summer course
Cool.
in hand-drawn animation. Yes. And so it's basically the squash and the stretch of a ball. Okay. So when a ball is bouncing, it's not literally stretching out to this long, elongated oval shape, and then it's not squashing down into this flattened oval. But that's what you do in the sequence of frames of a bouncing ball to show that it's like hitting the ground, and then as it's going up, it's stretching out, and then gravity is pulling it back down, and it's long again, and then it squashes down because it's a bit of the momentum is flattening it, right? So yes, it's a lot of exaggeration, but that is what does give it the illusion of this is actually gravity working on this bouncing ball.
Well, I mean, I don't know what's so, again, I just throw this on the table and it does it itself. So I don't know what's so impressive about that. But no, even though I don't work in animation and I like have no real understanding of how like even a software like After Effects works very much when it comes to doing that, I've always been, I don't know, I've just always appreciated it, probably because I can't do it, is probably why I appreciate it so much. But okay, but it is put in service of a story, and this story has a lot. It's more than just about how beautiful it is. There's also a lot of ugliness in here, and I don't know, what do we make about that? Like, you know.
Well, can I paint you a picture of my impression of the movie? Because to me, the movie started out so bright, so beautiful. You see this beautiful Christian family that pray together, that goes to church together. Everybody in the community is happy. Everybody's friendly. The people at church are friendly. The priest is friendly. This family is friendly. And everything is, the sky is very beautiful. And they're just happy. Geppetto's happy. And so then what happens is the tragedy hits. You see the bomb come in, and while they're working on the crucifix in the church, Carlo, Geppetto's son, is killed right there in the church. And by the way, they did such an incredible job with the church. I felt like Netflix was coming into my intimate space. Like, this is my house. That's how I felt. It's like, wow, this is so beautiful. It's in a Catholic church, my home, and Netflix and the secular world's coming in to see it and everything. And so then there's this huge break in that. And what you see, what I saw, was this is the problem of evil. This is the fundamental problem of evil. Where's God? How could God let such a terrible tragedy happen? So there's 3 really adult-themed questions going on right here. 1, the problem of war, the consequences of war. 2, the worst fear of any parent, pretty much, is losing your son or daughter. You're losing your child, and that happens. And then 3, this other big problem, which is, how could God allow such a terrible thing to happen? And notice how silent the wooden cross is. Jesus on the cross is completely silent. And what comes in after that is a very angry Geppetto. And the people in the church, the next scene that you see them in, they're being very ugly and nasty to Pinocchio. And the priest is seen as being friendly with the warmonger, the soldier in the story. And so in a way, they connect the church with the bomb, because you see the priest doing the Heil Hitler thing with the fascist Mussolini guy. And to me, I'm getting a lot of vibes of, okay, the church wasn't here for me. You know, God wasn't here for me. And so years go by, and one night, out of a drunken rage, Geppetto chops down this tree and forms Pinocchio out of it. And then, what do we see to come that brings life to this wooden inanimate object? this is one of the big shockers for me when I watch the movie. I'm used to the blue fairy and the depictions of a blue fairy, but what do we see immediately right off the bat? We have the several pairs of wings, the eyes, the multitude of eyes on the blue fairy or the sprite. And we have a very heavenly voice. And so I'm like, whoa, that is a depiction of a seraphim. And if you look at Ezekiel, now in Ezekiel, he actually calls it a cherubim, but it's very similar with the multiple pairs of wings. Ezekiel describes this being in Isaiah chapter 6, I believe. The seraphim comes down and purifies Isaiah. And then in Revelation chapter 4, you see this same imagery with the multiple pairs of wings and wings that cover the eye, which the first time you see the blue fairy, you actually see these wings be removed from her face. Wings that cover the body, and then wings that are for flying. All that is in Scripture. And if you look at how the medieval artists depicted the seraphim, that is almost a perfect depiction, the way that Del Toro had them animate this. And so I'm like, wow, that is an angelic being right off the bat. So the question is this an angelic being from God, or is this an angelic being from the darkness, or is it an enemy? And I think there are a couple more symbols that you will see later on, which is you see that what is the first symbol we have for the devil in Genesis? The serpent. And so that's one of the first symbols we have for this for evil, I guess you could say. And the tail of the other seraphim-like creature that is known as death has two serpents as a tail. And then in our modern depictions of angels, we usually don't get horns on the good angels. We usually only get horns on the bad angels. And so what do we see with death? It has the horns on the head, and you have the serpent tail. And so I'm getting a lot of very dark imagery that hints at where we're going with the rest of the spiritual aspect of this show. And so probably one other thing while I'm talking about it that really was a red flag for me was towards the end, the great lesson, which Pinocchio, he is a puppet without strings. So he is the perfect character to show to reflect disobedience or without being obedient, because I don't have strings. He says to his father, I won't obey you in the beginning. And then when he finds out that the puppet master was controlling him because of the monkey that helps him out, he decides to put on that show where he completely makes fun of Mussolini, who is there at the show. And so he completely goes rogue. And that's seen again as a good thing. And then the final test to show his disobedience is death, this blue seraphim-like creature, tells him he has to break the rules, the spiritual realm. Go and break everything. By the way, you're going to lose your eternal life, but if you want that so badly back on earth, that thing that you want to do, which is a really good, noble thing, which is to save Geppetto's life, that's an excellent thing. But if you want that, you got to break all the rules, and you got to break all. And so he goes and breaks all the hourglasses in the spiritual realm so that he can lose his eternal life and be a regular boy on earth. And that, to me, kind of flips the character of Jesus on its head, because Jesus is the perfect obedient son, whereas we have Satan, who his original sin was to say, I will not serve, disobedience. And when you look at the unfortunate religions that seem to think that Satan is a hero, what is their main motto? Do what thou wilt. That is their main motto. And so I'm seeing this symbolism and these messages throughout this movie. And so I'm like, ooh, I don't know if I want to show this to my child. Maybe a teenager, we can talk about it. But I mean, these are very serious themes. And back to that original problem of evil, I think Geppetto doesn't ever get an answer for that. But I mean, that is kind of what I felt when I watched the movie. Those are the things, the messages I was getting. And I just felt like ever since the beginning, where we have that break, where, you know, Christianity was so great in their life, they were doing the sign of the cross all the time. From then on, the church people were really ugly and mean, and the priest was really mean, and there was no real good Christian character, I would say. There was no character that seemed to be what a good Christian would represent.
Well, and as you pointed out, it was interesting when there was that line that Pinocchio says to Geppetto when he, I think, is distraught at the town people receiving him. He said, I'm made of wood and he's made of wood. Why do they like him? And he's pointing to Jesus on the cross, and they don't like me. And so you have that line. But then you also have, as you had said, the fact that the seraphim creature is what gives Pinocchio life. It's not Christ. You never see Christ alive. Right? God never seems alive or present. And so that adds to the confusion, maybe, especially from a Catholic child, of you never speak of Christ as if he's living. He's just this inanimate object on the cross. But Pinocchio is this very exuberant, lively character, right? In the real world. And Jesus is just other in the church.
Yeah.
I think it depends on
on
what you think Pinocchio is, in a way, because especially in this adaptation, because I feel like in the book, by the time you get to the end of it, and the reflections that are this edition put out by Well-Read Mom has reflections. It's called Pinocchio with Reflections on a Father's Love by Franco Nembrini. And so between each chapter, you get reflections on the chapter that you've just read, and that's very helpful as a way of analyzing it. But he sees Pinocchio's journey as the journey of humanity, and he sees the ending as an entrance into heaven, and the end. And I think it would be really helpful to actually, because we've talked a lot about the beginning, I think it'd be helpful too to talk about the end and analyzing how we think about Pinocchio. But I don't know. Because when I'm watching it, I do immediately think there are parallels, visual parallels and story parallels being drawn to Christ in this film. For one, Pinocchio just immediately takes on there's that scene in the church. Well, he's made of wood. I'm made of wood. Why do they not like me? He
stretches out his arms and poses like he's Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And then later he's put on the cross by the puppeteer.
Yes.
And so you're supposed to think this is a Christ figure, right?
Yes. And I think you are supposed to think that, but I don't know if that's, I wonder if it's a bit of I read it as a bit of a red herring, because I have this,
well, he does die. He does give up his life for Geppetto, which is a Christ-like thing to do.
Yes, he does. And
it is a very complex story, which is one thing that I think is so missing in any Christian film, is it's always so black and white, and there's no complexity at all, and that's very boring, which is why this is so interesting.
Yeah,
because you have so good elements, and then we're also going right up to that blurry line like you mentioned earlier, and I think they're just going to cross it, and I think it's very sneaky. the spiritual messages that are in this movie.
Well, it's written and directed by a lapsed Catholic,
who claims that he grew up with a mother who practiced witchcraft.
Is that right?
Yes, he does say that, and he called his mother a witch and said that she did spells and tarot cards and all the.
Yeah, and he's made a lot of films I admire. He's also made The Shape of Water, which I think is a piece of garbage. So, and morally and just like as a movie, I just think is rotten to the core. But I don't know. I think each piece of art can be assessed on its own merits. I think for instance, I think that a movie could be, I've used this example before, but a movie could be, have a pro-life message regardless if the filmmaker intended it. If it's baked into the cake of the story and the characters, and then at a certain point, the people who made it have no control over it, but you do kind of have to take it into account. I mean, Franco Nembrini points out that Carlo Collodi, the author of Pinocchio, even though he uses a lot of biblical imagery and draws a lot from different parables throughout the story, saw himself as a secularist, saw himself as an atheist, and yet,
but
in a way,
but I feel like I can relate to his moral messages a lot more in the book, because he is teaching very important lessons to young children. It's like, you should go to school, you should listen to your father, you shouldn't tell lies. And that's what's so interesting about this movie, is it's a little bit sneaky. It's like, well, you should not tell lies except for this time. You should not be obedient except for this time. It's these little exceptions that are.
But then again, it's like I think we're all in agreement that this is. I don't think that this is a movie for kids. I agree with Del Toro. It's not for kids. But what's interesting too is that children's stories, and I think these reflections in this book reveal it, is that children's literature and film has value for adults. There is something eternal in Pinocchio that has captured the imagination since. In fact, the most interesting thing that was brought up in this in the reflections aspect is that in the book, when Pinocchio comes back to life, that was actually not intended by the author at all. Can you describe that, Jessica?
Well, yes, and that was a part that was surprising to me, to read that reflection piece. That was very enlightening, that when Pinocchio is going with the fox and the cat to this field of miracles, which will multiply his money exponentially, which he can then take back to his parent or his father, which very good intention. So he's following them along and realizes that perhaps they aren't as they seem, these friends of his. And so he puts his money into his mouth and will not let it out. And the fox and the cat pry, and they wait for him. And then they hang him on a tree, and they wait and wait and wait for him to be strangled. But as a puppet, it seems that the laws are not quite the same for his body as ours. So they leave and they say, okay, we'll come back in the morning, and surely by then your mouth will hang open and we can take your money. So one, that shows us, reading the book initially, I didn't realize how much it was worth what that puppet master had given Pinocchio to take to his father, but it seems like it was worth quite a lot of money. So then the fox and the cat are trying to swindle him. He was supposed to die on that tree. Yeah. And so then reading that this is where the story was initially going to end.
Yeah, because it was,
by the way, the blue fairy wasn't a blue fairy. It was a ghost.
Right. It was a white-faced, blue-haired girl at a house.
It was supposed to end without a blue fairy, and it was supposed to end with a ghost.
And for context, this was published a couple chapters at a time in a literary magazine for children. And so the kids read this, and then what happens?
Well, and then yes, this girl who had initially rejected Pinocchio from the safety of her home, saying, I am dead and everyone else is dead here as well. Very haunting. Then we find that she's almost like this queen of the forest, fairy, magical person who brings him into her home, and there are these animal doctors, and we meet the cricket again, whom Pinocchio had smashed in the beginning, basically on their first meeting. And he is also a doctor, and they're consulting, is he dead or alive? Well, he is made of wood, which is a little tricky and complicated. But he is, in fact, alive. And so she fosters him and brings him back to health and says, your father will be coming along the road soon. He's on his way. I've called him. And Pinocchio says, I'll go out and meet him. But what happens? He's distracted. And back to the like reflection on Pinocchio as a representation of us. Earlier in the book, when he first opens his eyes and he's looking at Geppetto, and he's like fixedly, is the way it's described, fixedly looking around the room. That's very much like our own eyes, where we have our eyes wide open and we see everything in the world and we're distracted by everything. And so this is another instance of Pinocchio being distracted again and again from his good intention of going to meet his father. And then he goes on a different path.
Yeah. And I think what's fascinating too is that, you know, when we say that ending, that was supposed to be the end, it was supposed to be the end because that was supposed to be the final chapter. And Carlo Collodi was just like, well, that wraps up the story as far as I'm concerned. And then all the children readers kept sending in letters to the literary magazine saying, you have to bring him back to life. You have to bring him back to life. So I think that's so interesting that this thing that seems to be this perfect, that even on the outside, I think seems like this perfect object of a story of moral tales, that the trajectory of the story literally came out of a human desire of many real children to live and to go on. I think that's just beautiful. Like there was something beyond even the author's intention that brought Pinocchio to life in a way. I don't know. Yeah,
I don't think Pinocchio would have become the classic it is without that have happened. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it kind of shows that to me, it just shows that this need for the resurrection, for good to triumph over evil, is baked into the cake of humanity, which I think is just beautiful. It just shows that, this desire is real, and it can bring Pinocchio back to life, because it did in the literary sense. One thing I love about the movie is that, like, when it comes to the characters, like Sebastian Cricket, Geppetto, and Pinocchio, they're all at this point in their lives where they think their life is over, but it's actually only just begun. Pinocchio is a tree who's chopped down, but actually it's just the beginning. Geppetto thinks his life is over because he's lost his son and he's resigned himself, but it's actually just the beginning. And Sebastian J. Cricket is already writing his autobiography, what he calls it, like Stridulations of My Youth by Sebastian J. Cricket. And he's like, and he thinks, and then
he gets uprooted from his home.
Yeah. And then it turns out like the greatest adventure is just around the corner. That I think is a positive, like subtle message in the film, that
it also is very noble of him to give up wealth, power, and everything just for one little boy to live.
It is, because he's given one wish.
That was very noble of him, and I approve of that message.
I think the endings of all of these versions of the film are so enlightening. The story are so enlightening. So we all know the Disney one, which is that he escapes from Pleasure Island. He goes into the belly of the whale to save Geppetto, and he is successful, Pinocchio, but he dies. But because he sacrificed himself, the Blue Fairy gives him life. This is the way that the Disney animators streamlined the story, I think, brilliantly.
Which is the original story. You die on Earth in order to gain your eternal life in heaven. Mm-hmm. In this story, it's flipped.
In a way.
You live in order to, like, you would have had eternal life if you've lived, but he loses eternal life for dying for someone else instead.
Yeah. And then in the movie, it becomes, in this Del Toro version, as much hope and light as I want to see in it, I can see it as it's very existential. It's just like, because the last line of the film is, we're here and then we're gone. And
there's no eternal life message for everybody else.
And yet there is an afterlife in the film. And so it's very it's confusing of how to
that's
interpret
true.
it.
That's
So there
true.
is an afterlife. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, on earth in the Christian, like even in our Catholic theology, I mean, we are here and we're gone. Although, I mean, our bodies are ashes to ashes. I mean, we're still here. But how to unpack that, I don't know. I think about that image. The last shot of the film is a pine cone falling from a tree.
Yeah.
And that was one, I mean, I asked a couple of questions for you guys to think about, but even if we only ask one question, I just want to think, what did you guys interpret about the pine cones? Because pine cones are here throughout the film. They're a motif. They keep coming up.
Yeah.
What did you guys make of that?
Stylistic choice.
Definite motif. Well, it is interesting. So if you're looking biblically, as we have been, the pine cone, you plant the pine cone, it grows a tree. And what's interesting is then when you delve into what went into the making of the movie and making of the characters, those character artists and designers actually did a lot of studying the mathematics and the physical quality of the pine cone. And when they
Here's
were
a visual
consulting,
example. I have some pine cones on this.
what makes the
very
perfect
imperfect,
pine
right?
cone, what makes the imperfect, because they needed to reinvent that. They needed to make that physically themselves. They didn't pick a pine cone off the ground and put that on set. It was something they created.
And it couldn't look too perfect, or it wouldn't
Right.
look real.
And yes, and so they followed the laws of nature to create this. But when it came to designing those creatures of life and death, the wood sprite and death, if you will, but their sisters, life and death, one of the designers said their tails, instead of scales, ought to be this pattern of the pine cone. And where I think that ties in is the pine cone is already a representation of life and death in the movie. It is the cause of the death of Carlo going back into the church when the bomb is falling. And then they plant it, it brings the tree, so it has life, cut it down, and then it leads to the life of Pinocchio.
And that's
so
what
I
Geppetto
think,
says. He tells
Yes.
Carlo that this pine cone must die so that another one may live.
Exactly.
Which it does remind me biblically of when Jesus says, unless a grain falls to the ground and dies, then it cannot be fruitful and multiply.
But even before that, earlier than that, it harkens back to the trees in the Garden of Eden. You think of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It leads to the death in a way of Adam and Eve because they must leave the garden. And then they have the physical death, whereas they had eternal life, as far as we know, in the garden beforehand. And so I think that very much, as it states in the film, but then if you look at it through a biblical lens, it is life and death.
Yeah, I would say the pine cone represents life and death in this movie.
I wonder, what would you guys think if it was Pinocchio? If Pinocchio... So when
Go
I
ahead
watched
and
the
explain
movie,
that.
well, I guess when I watched the movie, I think there's definitely Christ parallels there. But when I think of that ending, will he? Jiminy Cricket in the voiceover, which by the way, I think it's very beautiful. Jiminy Cricket narrates the film. He's called Sebastian J. Cricket in this adaptation, but he narrates the film even after death. He says, "I died one day, but Pinocchio still carried me around in his heart." And to me, I think about that image of a seeing Pinocchio's body as a tomb in a way. I think of him strapped to that cross, which is very on the nose symbolism. But then I think, well, is he? He's a piece of wood. He's a tree. Is he meant to represent the gift of creation? Is he the cross? Is he the literal cross? Is he the literal tomb that we take part in? When we're buried, we are in the ground. Is that what we're supposed to take away from it?
I guess he is a literal tomb for the cricket.
He is, yeah. He's his home. He's his tomb. I still don't necessarily think that makes it an explicitly Christian tale and message. I still feel that's an existentialist point of view, or.
Well, I think when we go back to the problem, okay, Geppetto is another main character, and throughout the whole movie, he's grieving. That's what he's dealing with, is grieving his son's death. And I think at the end, that is supposed to be an answer to that. Is like, well, we actually hold on to everybody in our hearts. You always have the memory of that person forever. And so that's the best you can do. I think that's the message. But as a Christian, I would say, well, there's actually going to be a much more physical resurrection of your loved ones. And so that really reminds me back to what do we allow our children to watch? Because a lot of people may be afraid to let their children watch a movie like Lion King where there's death. You know, do you want to tackle death at this age or this age or this age? Well, we happen to not like shelter from death, but we simply talk about our belief in heaven. And so when something dies, our daughter comes to us and said, oh, it's in heaven, or he's in heaven, or she's in heaven. And so it's a very, it's not traumatic for her. And and it's because we aren't afraid of death. As Christians, we're not afraid of it at all. Death, where is thy sting, right? So I think in this movie, the message is that you don't need to be afraid of death because you'll remember those that died.
Right.
Which is all right.
Yeah, it's okay. It's like most secular humanist things. It's like, yeah, it's fine.
I mean, it gets them by.
I mean, yeah. That hits home about The Lion King, because my daughter loves The Lion King, but I do struggle with I try to not say anything when Mufasa dies. I mean, I just get uncomfortable, like thinking like, what if I die? Because I'm always thinking about that. Like, that's just the kind of person I am. But
and that's why Lion King is such a great movie.
Yeah, because
Simba does get to talk to his father again. You know, that's a very moving part of the movie when he comes in the clouds and stuff. So cool.
Yeah.
By the way, since we're talking about Geppetto and the loss of his son, this movie would, in theory, should be very intimate to me in my life story, because I am Pinocchio in this sense. My parents had 3 children, 2 boys and then a daughter. And once they had the daughter, they said they were done. They weren't going to have any more children. But when my brothers were in a car accident, the oldest was 17, Sonny, and the next oldest, Nathan, was about 15. Sonny died in that car accident. And they life-lighted my brother to the hospital. They lifelined him. And my dad was so angry with God when that happened. He was so upset. And a year before that, he lost his brother. And maybe a year before that, his youngest brother. So he lost 2 of his brothers, and then the third death, his firstborn son. He was so mad in that hospital bed at night, and he was telling God, because he was a Catholic, but I would say he would say that he wasn't a necessarily devout Catholic. He was talking to God, and then suddenly he describes a presence, like almost like a light in the room, came and just completely calmed him and spoke. My son died too. Along those lines. That's what he felt. It wasn't like an audible voice. It was just a knowing that God was there, and that's what he said. And suddenly he felt like everything was going to be okay. He was going to have peace. and he was going to look to God for answers. And that really catapulted his reversion, or it was like a conversion of sorts, where his heart was on fire for God. Everybody at the hospital, the doctors, they were all noticing that my parents were taking this extremely well.
Because their second son was on the verge of death.
Yeah, they were in the hospital because he was on the verge of death, and they were like putting all kinds of metal rods in him to keep him together and stuff. And so because of that miraculous encounter that my dad had, they gave their life over to God, and they decided to have another son. Or they didn't know it was going to be a son. They had another kid. And they said, well, we're going to give this kid to God to begin with. And then after I was born, they went ahead and had some more children, because Catholics are open to life. And so in a way, I have this connection with this story, but I can see why I don't relate to it, because my dad wasn't like Geppetto. He trusted in God and he had peace. Whereas Geppetto, he was angry and bitter and never got over it, and never, like, you know what I mean?
I do.
Kind of see that connection?
No, I do. I see.
And so I didn't relate to that as much, but I mean, I sympathize with those that don't have, maybe they didn't have that connection with God when they prayed. I sympathize with that. I'm sorry.
Right. And Guillermo Del Toro, a lot of what he's working out, as he admits, is that I think his disconnect with his father. A lot of his stories do follow that theme of figuring out the father-son relationship, and he seems like he was closer to his mother than his father. And so I can see that you feel that you don't relate to his version, because a lot of himself and his story and his feelings with the church and with family, he's projected onto his Pinocchio.
That's what he admits in some of his interviews. So
I do think that it's funny, because I start at the beginning with the story. I think I see Pinocchio as an extension of his despair, and in the same way that the crucifix, which he's allowed to stay broken, is an extension of his despair. But what you're pointing out is that he might not have an avenue for does he ever come to peace with it, like Job would, for instance? You could see him as a Job figure, but does he actually ever submit to God's plan and providence? Looking back on the story, I'm not sure.
Geppetto does find peace eventually with Pinocchio. He does accept him as his son, and he grows old with him.
That's true.
And so that is comforting.
Yeah. And as you say, it's nice. It's good. But it could be that maybe Del Toro isn't willing to take that next leap, even though it's all around the film. Like, you can tell, like, that he has, like, that his Catholic upbringing never left him, and he has tremendous respect for it. I don't see a bad priest being a representation of the church. I see it as a weak priest who is submitting to a regime.
Yeah, I think I'd be totally okay with a bad priest in the movie. But the problem I have is that it seemed like everybody in the church was the same way. It's like everybody responded to the war the same way Geppetto did, you know? I feel like they were so friendly to Geppetto and Carlo in the beginning, but when Pinocchio came in the church after all this time, they were ugly to Pinocchio. They were mean, and and then whenever they did the sign of the cross, I thought that was disingenuous. To me, it felt like from then on.
Like when Pinocchio was revived.
Like throughout the movie, from then on, it's like, oh, this is kind of more of a prop than a genuine faith. But that's probably just because of the context I was getting from the rest of the movie. But
well, to bring it back to, I think as a point of contrast, it's helpful again to return to the book, which has an ending that actually surprised me quite a bit. having thought I knew the Pinocchio story with one specific detail, that it is similar. He does become a real boy, but he is a real boy, and yet the puppet Pinocchio is still physically exists in a corner next to a chair. And that was a detail in the book that I thought was fascinating, thinking I knew the story from the Disney movie, where Pinocchio, the wooden boy, just becomes real and his body transforms. And this one, which takes a more secular view, which is that he doesn't physically change, just something about his character changes. But in the original book, he does become a real boy, and yet this other body is left behind. The Franco Nembrini sees this as like a clue that this is an entry into heaven, and we are real when we enter heaven, when we and that's where
when we're transfigured.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah.
I don't know if we get transfigured right away, but after the second coming and the judgment, we'll be transfigured into heaven.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
But he sees it as the story of humanity, and that's where Nembrini interprets this as is that heaven is our final journey, and it's not that we're here and we're gone, the way Del Toro puts it. And there's no look. What do you think? What are some final thoughts on this film?
Have we gone you over to our side?
Yeah, a little bit. Well, I could even just say into this. I mean, first of all, thank you both so much for coming, because this is. I mean, I knew that this would be a good conversation.
I knew you really liked this movie, and I didn't mean to just completely sabotage it.
Well, I think discussions about movies. I think people hold their opinions about movies too sacredly. I think that movies are great and important because they give us a safe space in a way to talk about real things.
The real ideas. Yeah.
And whether you like it or not is almost like the third or fifth most important thing about it, I feel like. Would you recommend it to a friend? Because I recommend it to you guys.
I would recommend it to a friend to talk about it with, because I love to talk about these ideas, and it is interesting. And because of these spiritual implications that it deals with, I think it'd be a great conversation starter.
Yeah. And then I could just recommend it for the merit of the stop motion and the artistry there. But definitely the conversation piece. And if they're not as maybe lean toward that as much and more just the creative type, then I would say look at it and think about all that they did into making it. And I mean, I obviously I would recommend it, but the reason I wanted to have another perspective on is because I think it brings up all of these complicated views, and I'm not even sure if it's capable of, if maybe it bites off a bit more than it can chew in a way, but that's interesting. And that's something that I wish that more entertainment in general did. Like if it just really swing for the fences.
A lot of the entertainment is pretty flat.
Yeah.
And, they're only tackling maybe one or two things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, after watching this several times, I am kind of wanting to go see the Minecraft movie, just to
I actually enjoy Jack Black.
Yeah. I do too.
I kind of think that it might be interesting, but we'll see.
Yeah, mm-hmm. I'm sure I'll see it 1,000 times in a couple of years when it's on Netflix. Well, because of my kids, I just then if Rosie sees it and likes it, we'll see it 1,000 times. So I'm sure you guys know the feeling. Guys, thanks so much for joining me on this show. I hope that what's a movie you guys would want to watch? Would want the film club to talk about?
Well, since I kind of said that this movie wasn't necessarily a Christian moral movie, I would recommend looking at Disney's live action Cinderella, even though it's a little bit old, but I'd say it's the most Christian movie that Disney made in the last 20 years. And the reason why is because Cinderella is a model Christian. Because of her mother's passing away, she tells her to have courage and be kind. And so it displays a great example of what it means to turn the other cheek and what it means to be the servant of others. So yeah, there's a lot to look into that particular.
I've had a lot of people recommend that to me recently, and I've never seen it, so I feel like I should check it out. Yeah,
I didn't think anybody else.
It wasn't really up
that.
my alley at the time when it came out. You know?
I didn't know anybody else was recommending that. That's funny.
Yeah,
Right.
it's a zeitgeist. Is there anything you would recommend that you'd like people to like?
Oh, well, I'm a longtime fan of Little Women, and the adaptations always fall short in my expectations. The 2019 film in particular, I was not happy with, but it would be interesting to have someone really dive into some of the story choices there. And I think part of the struggle is from, this is basically just a story of the drama of real life. And for some reason, that is very hard to replicate on the screen because they want to fill in gaps or they just skip way ahead. So
I was in
that would
the
be
worst.
interesting.
I was in a play that was in high school that was the worst adaptation of Little Women possible. They cut out the death. They didn't include Jo going to starting her career. It just stopped when the dad came home, and I was like, "Why are we doing this?" So I was Laurie, and I like purposely put my hair up like Edward in Twilight just because I thought that was funny.
How old were you when you did that?
I was like 15.
Oh, cool. That's a great character to play.
Yeah, when there's actual drama, because they cut that out too.
Right, yeah. So you didn't have the failed proposal.
There's
and
worse
everything.
versions, is what I'm saying.
Yes, yeah.
Guys, thanks so much for coming, and I really hope you guys come back again. And I'll just talk to this camera now. This has been the Catholic Film Club, coming to you from the Center for Catholic Media at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. To see these episodes ahead of time, subscribe to media.benedictine.edu, where we've got other great podcasts and articles and masterclass series out on interesting topics. Consider giving to our giving page if you like this, so that we can produce more shows like this. Follow us on Instagram at media.benedictine. You can reach out to us by email at filmclub@benedictine.edu. Our next film club feature is going to be the Coen Brothers movie Hail Caesar. Have you guys seen that? Hail Caesar? No. It's very funny. It's a very funny movie where George Clooney is a Hollywood star who's kidnapped by communists, basically. That's where the movie starts, and it stars him, and everybody in Hollywood stars in the movie too, has a cameo. And then we've got an Easter break coming up, but after that, we're going to be talking about Michael B. Jordan in the movie Sinners, starring Michael B. Jordan and Michael B. Jordan, because he plays twins in the movie. And not a lot of people can tell that from the advertising. So all that's coming up on the Catholic Film Club. John and Jessica, thank you so much. God bless.
Oh, yeah.